Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Documentary Crafts panel. My name is Josia Elliott, and I'm a producer in the true crime and comedy world. And I'm so excited to talk about our talented panelists about their work on documentary projects. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. We have Charles Olivier. He is the editor on Surviving Ohio State. We have Dylan Young, and he's the editor of Magic City and American Fantasy.
That's me.
Next, we have the composer of multiple nature documentary projects like The Tale of the Sleeping Giants. Please welcome Panu Aaltio. Let's dive in. So, just a general question that I wanted to put out there for everybody is when you first watched the raw footage or heard the story pitch, what image, sound, or emotion stuck with you and became a compass for your work?
It's a really good question. I think for me, and I think probably for a lot of editors, trying to find, call it a compass or a sort of a touchstone that's going to be helpful to speak with a director. The person who's creating it is, for me, kind of where I go, which is to try and create I say sort of like a tapestry, the emotional colors of a film. And so I always think of music. Um, I think a lot of editors kind of usually have a background in some form of music. And so for me, that's kind of where I go. And so I'll go often to scores or tracks or things like that. And so for Ohio, um, the composer Michael Donna is one who I really love, and he has the score for the Ice Storm, which is kind of the thing that I thought of, and it's this really fascinating and very propulsive score that's about betrayal and tragedy, but it's also got comedic elements to it, kind of absurdist element to it. And so that's where I went. And that was the thing that I would keep coming back to. And it allowed me also to be able to share that with the director and say, like, does this feel like this is within the arena of the world that we're creating?
Wow.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback off of that because a lot of the times I'll end up sort of putting together a playlist to share with the director and sort of get a vibe, make sure we're on the same page in terms of like how we want the story to feel. Um, but for Magic City in particular, since the show is about like a club in Atlanta, um, it felt like when I was going through the footage, it felt like I was learning secrets that I shouldn't know. Um, because there's like things in the club that people like don't talk about or stories from the club that no one's told for like 20 years that they're now like telling and I felt like learning a secret and I kind of took that nugget as like okay well I want to proceed with the idea of like well I shouldn't tell you this but and that sort of informed how we went about telling the stories in the series.
Yeah, I think for me, it's cool hearing Charlie and Dylan say music was sort of a starting point because obviously as a composer, it's nice to hear, and it's certainly um, I often want to be there early as possible to be sort of service to editors and the director obviously and everybody to sort of provide some kind of new angle and so I love to sort of learn about just some central ideas in the film or series and what like in Tale of the Sleeping Giants, a good example is they had this idea together, the editor and director, about having this sort of sense of communication between the animals. That there was like a message that went out from the whales in the beginning, and it sort of travels throughout the nature. And I just got really obsessed with trying to experiment different ideas of how can you make music that sounds like a message, and that really took me on a very interesting path there. So I love when there's like these overall ideas that I can sort of latch on to in the beginning and just start from scratch. And then we might talk reference music later, but it's lovely to have that sort of empty canvas and just go off the ideas first.
It's so interesting to hear how you all navigate. I want to ask a question to Charlie. For Surviving Ohio State, how did you structure narrative to balance the factual integrity, personal stories, and emotional resonance?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, it's like not to just stay in the arena of music, but in a lot of ways, I I think it can be very useful in terms of structuring, and it's kind of a bigger question, but one of the things that I typically do in looking at structuring a documentary is to look at, and this sounds pretentious, but I mean, it shouldn't be, but is to look at kind of like a symphonic form, to look at movement of a film as opposed to say acts. And part of that is just trying to sculpt things like emotional resonance or things like themes and look to see how that can develop and how we can counterpoint it, um, how we can start to play with something that feels much more fluid than what can feel like to me with writing, can feel a little bit more um, enclosed. And so with Ohio State, even though it's a very sort of expositional film, we really tried to get as loose with it as possible. And so, not to kind of go off on tangents, but so the beginning, we tried to set up a lot of what would be themes. And the story is one of a lot of people versus an institution. And so, like a lot of the times when you've got something that's like a systemic um, uh, crime, you try to like anchor in a person. And so the same thing with this is that was to try to land with one person and then start pulsing wider. And so was looking at structuring between like character and then event structures in which people would come in. Um, and then in terms of integrity, this was kind of the first film I'd ever had like teams of lawyers, just like all cuts had to go through all these lawyers because it was this question of when these people will sue. Because we were kind of going after the Ohio State University, which was, a huge player within the Big Ten, which is like a massive sort of money bringer. And we're going after the athletic department and kind of, charging complicity. Then you had people from Congress, Jim Jordan being an Ohio State representative. And so all these people were already lawyered up. And so there was a kind of Scientology type of caution as we went into it. So you had like HBO lawyers and lawyers from all the different production houses. And so they would come through it. But the thing that was cool about that, without going through it, I mean, it was a drag at times. But what was good about it was that when you were moving, you felt kind of unassailable because you like everything was true. And that gave a lot of space to kind of create emotional resonances, and you can start to push like all the other aspects of a film.
That kind of brings me to the next general question because, what you talked about involved so many different departments in order to tell the truth. And so collaboration across departments, they can transform a documentary. And could each of you share a moment when you intersected with, maybe unexpectedly with another department and pushed the project into a direction that you hadn't anticipated?
One thing that really comes to mind is there was a nature film I did called Nature Symphony, where the whole idea was actually we would just have images and music, and it was basically not supposed to have any sound. But then we kind of felt like we needed an intermission in between, and just let's have some nature sound. And our sound designer came in and did a wonderful sound design for the middle of the movie, sort of natural, realistic sound, and just sort of seeing that in context that you've been listening, your brain is primed to think like I'm listening to music, and you've been doing that for 30 plus minutes, and then you end music and you go into purely natural sound, and the way you sort of experience that as music, the nature, not just bird song but everything, the wind, the leaves, everything, that was sort of magical. And it was completely unexpected, because I was sort of like, we were just having a break in the music, it's not a big deal, but it was actually like, so that's my favorite part of the movie. And when the music comes back, I'm like, oh no, it's too soon. I was really enjoying that. But yeah, that was definitely one.
Yeah, those sort of unexpected collaborations could be a lot of fun. I was working on a project where a lot of how they wanted to do the recreations was animation. And so the director, for the most part, was kind of like, all right, we'll do these bits in animation, these bits we have footage for, and we kind of just worked it from there. Uh, but it got to the point where the animation director and I were working so closely because she'd be sending me things, I'd be putting them in the cut, we'd be going back and forth on how to make it work out. Um, that I sort of just started pitching ideas to her, and then she'd kind of like put some stuff together, and then we'd go back to the director and be like, "Well, what about these things? Like, how about we just add a couple random little things over here?" And um, I hadn't really expected that I would be like making animations at some point in my career, but uh, it was a fun little moment to do it, and I definitely think it made the show stronger. So it was a fun little collab.
I'm going to jump over to Dylan, and I know that you worked on Magic City, and this is like a multi-episode docuseries, and I know it's a cultural institution is what it's about. So
Hmm.
how did you like handle the editing approach to that with the multiple story threads? How did you keep a through line through all of it?
Yeah. Well, a lot of the structure is kind of dictated by we split up the episodes kind of by era of the club. So a lot of the stories sort of fit into different timelines uh, of those particular episodes. But then for our sort of main characters, the family that owns the club, that are kind of central throughout the whole story, we went about sort of making like a general arc for each person, and then dividing them in a way that would feel satisfying within each episode. Um, so for the ex-wife of the club owner, she from the get-go was not on board with the idea of opening a club. Um, and by the sort of middle-ish of the series, she's in a situation where she has to sort of be reliant on it, and she has to come to appreciate some of the things that it is providing for her family, keeping her kids fed, etc. Um, so we sort of explored different aspects of the things that she didn't like about the club, and how we could sort of how she sort of changed her mind on each of those things in each episode, um, in a way that if you watch like each one, it's like, okay, she, you know, doesn't really appreciate like what the dancers are doing, but then by the end of the episode, she can sympathize with them. So she has like an arc for that, but it is all part of her larger arc for coming around uh, to the idea of the club in general. Um, and so we sort of did that approach for each character or things that were going to be sort of threaded throughout the whole series. Um, and then, yeah, everything else sort of fit through a time period. And we sort of allocated those to individual episodes and moved on that way. Um, but it was a fun challenge to sort of have to put things into digestible bites for like each individual chunk of the story.
All right. Like I don't think I've ever heard it anchored in like one specific person's emotional journey along with a chronological timeline. I think that's really interesting. For The Tale of Sleeping Giants, your score was recognized as atmospheric and nature mythic qualities that it had. How do you balance the almost spiritual elements of the with like the raw nature of just and the beauty in that documentary realism?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of I think that basically happens in spotting, because I kind of view often the nature films, they're kind of like how you interact with nature yourself. If you go into nature, you first start to listen to the individual sounds, the birds and the leaves and the wind. There's maybe water, but then it starts to become this bigger experience that's sort of bigger than you. There's maybe a sense of wonder that builds, and there's some kind of, you kind of feel small in the middle of it all, and that's the music. So it's sort of like the first part is the sound, and then that's the music, how you feel about it, and then kind of the spotting is just finding the moments in the film where we want to feel those other things, and then there are other places where we just want to listen for a while, and that's I guess the way to balance those for me at least.
Yeah, and you have to use your artistic discernment probably to find those moments.
Yeah, sure, for sure. And it's a collaborative process, obviously, with a lot of input from the director and the editor, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Nicholas, you worked on the Alabama Solution and the Squad. How do you develop the style that you use for cinematography to fit each project or documentary feature?
I think, yeah, sympathetic observer, I think is a very great descriptor in terms of how I approach too a lot of like the more sensitive or more personal aspects of someone telling a story. Um, because a lot of it, when it comes down to like working with interviews and stuff, like I don't feel like I'm telling the story. I feel like I'm letting that person tell the story, and I feel like a very sympathetic observer in that regard. Um, and for the most part, I tend to lean towards the side of like I think my work should feel invisible uh, in those moments in particular. There are other times where it's like, all right, let's have some fun, but when it's personal subjects or more like heavy things, yeah, I want to be as invisible as possible.
Mhm.
I work in true crime a lot, and so that's just a really great way to know because I'm on set. So it's like you definitely you want their truth, but then you also have the agenda of making a product. So it's that balance.
Yeah, but you also want them to trust you, but then you can't have them be like, well, you can help me, right?
Right. You have to stay in your full integrity, in my opinion, and you don't take a project that doesn't want the truth. And so I think that's how I would manage it, is just knowing I chose a project that has integrity, so I, I just feel free to fly in that sense. It's probably a little different in the editing bay though, right?
I Not necessarily. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know about Charlie. I end up doing a lot of manipulation of people's sentences just to like either get them shorter or kind of make them make a more clear sense, but I never want to change what they're saying. I just change how they're saying it.
So no Frankenbiting for you. That's a
I'll do a little bit, but as long as it doesn't really change like the idea of what they're trying to say.
right.
Yeah.
There's an integrity to that I think is important. Um, but that can get tricky sometimes.
It does get tricky because you get into a whole sort of realm of what is the spirit of the truth
Yeah.
and what is the truth, and it's like it's kind of the battlefield, you know. It's like I worked on a documentary, The Jinx, and
Oh
they had
yeah. Okay.
taken, yeah, like this, like one kind of flip of a line,
Mhm.
which became kind of the hallmark of its first season. But it was still sort of within what they would say is the spirit of the truth, and I agree with that. But a lot of people had a lot of problems with that manipulation.
I get it. There's also
Yeah,
like one person's truth is can be their truth, but it might not be the truth of like reality. I think that is a really interesting
for
area to
sure.
highlight.
Yeah, for sure.
I have come in the last couple years to decide that everything is true in terms of like if somebody believes it, then that is true
Totally.
to them, whether or not it is within the reality of existence.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to explain that in a way, if someone wants to like, yeah, explain something in a way that they believe is real, I will entertain that. to an extent.
It's their truth.
Yeah,
And that then you can later be like, are they a reliable narrator? Probably not,
yeah.
but it's their truth. And so but it's crucial in order for you to get that perspective and that rawness, you do have to be a little invisible. It's that line.
I did a fun back and forth with that with one of the stories in Magic City was about these two. We had interviewed a couple of like previous dancers that worked there, and one of them was telling a story about how Deion Sanders had come into the club, and one of the other dancers was annoying him, so he gave this dancer Platinum his very expensive watch, and he was like, "You should go beat her up." So she went over to the other girl, Strawberry, and was like, "Hey, like he's gonna give me this watch. I'll give you I'll give you a cut of the cash tomorrow. Let me just like hit you. We'll do like a fun little thing. It'll just, whatever. We'll get paid." Um, so she tells the story her way, and then we flip to Strawberry telling the story from her perspective, and she does not remember it the same way at all. Um, and in the moment, it's Platinum's story is told as like a fun sort of like, oh, haha, like this thing that happened. It's funny. But then when we switch to Platinum's perspective or to Strawberry's perspective, it's like, no, this is like kind of a very serious thing, and we sort of get into that sort of is our transition into like a section on sort of violence within the club, and it is a turning point, but it's one that we played with the perspective on.
And there are two sides to every story, sometimes more. And so I think that's I can't wait to watch this.
It's
Yeah,
yeah, it's
it's really
fun.
cool that we're reframing it that way. That sounds amazing. Yeah.
We had also established this motif of like anytime someone's sitting down to like tell you a fun story, like the title pops up and it's like, the $45,000 watch, like as told by Platinum.
Right.
And then we do a thing where like it gets deleted and gets like, as told by Strawberry. It's like,
Right.
oh, okay, haha, this is fun, but then it becomes like a more serious thing.
Yeah.
And it was a fun framing device to play with for sure.
For sure. So, everybody, looking back on your most recent projects, what is the one creative choice that you feel especially proud of seeing?
In all sincerity, kind of looking back at work, because there's that kind of old adage, it's never finished. You just kind of run out of time. But it makes me think of something Panu was talking about, in which music dropped out, and so it was kind of opening itself up to the natural world. And on two previous projects, those were decisions, in terms of sound, but also just in terms of editing and pace. And they were these sort of conscious decisions to pull away from a drive, a sort of a gripping aspect of the story that can make a story somewhat sort of invisible. You're sort of moving and going through narrative chops, and to kind of land the viewer in the room. And so it would either be, I'm thinking of like one or two that was like in a deposition, in which suddenly like music's gone, you're in this room, it's just the sound of the room. It's uncomfortable for the person in front of the camera, and ultimately it's running long enough that you start to feel a little awkward, like it's not fun anymore. Um, and it has a very interesting quality. The other one that I did that in, or we did that in, it was in the Jinx, in some courtroom sessions, in which suddenly you sort of have the courtroom sounds, the person walking up and sitting down, and it's the time suddenly isn't getting cut up, but you're in that moment, and that moment becomes heightened in a way that I think it otherwise wouldn't have, if it hadn't been sort of juxtaposed by a world that was sort of driving a story forward. It's like suddenly the brakes are on and you're here, and now we're here for a while, and you start to really kind of like look at someone, and it's almost theatrical in that way. And on both of those, I thought they were really effective in starting to get to a question of truth, and to these moments of honesty. in especially in a story about sincerity and betrayal and these sorts of things. You start to really feel like who this person is, and that became really interesting. And I was really happy with both of those that they were in there.
Yeah, that actually kind of reminds me of a short film I'm cutting right now. There's a moment where uh, the main subject is explaining about how she lost her mother. Um, and we're looking at old footage of the mother. We're getting to know her through that. But then we land on a moment where we just sit with the subject uh, while she's very emotional um, for arguably way too long. It's like a solid minute and a half of just no cuts, just her on camera talking and being emotional. But it's extremely resonant, and I haven't shown it to anyone who hasn't cried yet um, while watching it, which is just it's very impactful. But it's not often that I feel like I get a chance to just sit in footage for that long. Um, and when you get a chance to do that, it does, yeah, it usually creates its own moment because it's a break of kind of the typical, formula or run of show or etc. So those can be wielded in very interesting ways.
Yeah, silence can be a very powerful tool and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So you don't often see it on screen. And when you do, you never forget it. So that's, yeah, I can feel it. Fanu?
Yeah, if I have to pick one, I would probably think of in Tale of the Sleeping Giants when we were trying to have this sense of a message or communication in the music. And I had tried all kinds of sort of signal type motifs, and it just kind of sort of fell short of feeling like they lifted the scenes up. So I did ask the director to send me like a couple of key phrases from the script, and I took those to the vocal recording sessions. We had this wonderful vocal group, and they I asked them to just read the text while keeping an A minor chord or keeping an E minor chord, and then everyone was looking at me weird because it sounded like this strange religious ceremony. You're just reading text and keeping a constant note, and it doesn't sound like at all like it fits the film. But I was like, I want to try something, and I went home and I started sort of just making these sort of randomized textures within a single chord. So you still keep the constant chord, but it becomes this. It doesn't. It's almost like speech, but not really. So it's basically somewhere between music and speech, and that when we place that in some of the scenes, like there's like these crows that are just flying about, and when you hear this, you kind of have this strange sense that they're really up to something, and there's like this mystic quality to them almost. So it ended up working surprisingly well, and the director felt that was like his favorite cue in the entire score. So it was just this random experiment that I decided to do at the end of the vocal session, and it ended up being like a really important sort of part of the sort of structure of the film. So yeah, I think that's definitely one.
I think a lot of some of the best moments can come out of these like random sort of problem solving situations where you just have like you're like, I don't know how to deal with this, and then sort of inspiration strikes and something weird happens, and it ends up being like one of the coolest moments. um I sort of I did something like that with Magic City because we had a story that got added a little bit after. It was very towards the end of post, and the recreations had been shot already, so there wasn't an opportunity to like shoot any new footage. But we had one guy telling a story about how he used to be a bank robber, and obviously we didn't have like any archival footage for this scenario. But I was sort of racking my brain about like what to do with this, and I had this old Super 8 projector as a kid and a bunch of reels that I was just like obsessed with. And I remember that one of them was this old cartoon where this wolf character was always trying to chase a bunny and eat him, but he would drink, he would smoke, he was running from the cops. It was this old Soviet cartoon from like 60 years ago called Nupagadi. And this character in the show. His name is Mr. Wolf. That's what they refer to him as. And I was like, okay, so it might be fitting. This cartoon might actually be perfect. So I went and found some like high res scans of this cartoon, um, and just used that for visuals of while he's telling the story of robbing banks. And it worked out perfectly. So now there's this moment in the show where there's just this sequence of this old Soviet cartoon playing out, telling the story of Mr. Wolf, the bank robber. And it was sort of just like a happy accident that came about.
That's one of those moments where like you get to bring your art into something and you can't write those. Like it's really about who you bring on. So it just shows just how every individual in an ensemble really does make the project. I think we're out of questions, guys. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to say?
I was just actually going to kind of go off of what you were saying, just which is a lot of those moments in which you're kind of stuck. You're in some kind of a corner, and you say, often can't, I know I can't even really fully articulate what it is I'm looking for. And so you kind of end up hunting and looking and creating something. And it's almost like you're this in a kind of sponge state. And for whatever reason, that's often when you'll sort of like have the ensemble group, or it's like you'll find this cartoon, or so it's just like you find the things that you're looking for. I had it with one is like we had shot everything and it was still not working, and then it's like me on the floor taking iPhone photos of like pieces of paper and things, and it was just to kind of cover it, and it's like it ends up that's what we end up using. um but I think it's before that, if I were to explain what it is I'm trying to like I have no idea. It's like, but it's like you just know that like something needs to happen, in like in the most vague ways. And you just start to kind of like you start to just kind of open yourself up to solutions that are kind of out of a typical box. And that's usually, I think, the things that are the scariest. I know I'm usually an anxious mess and thinking like this scene isn't working, we're dead. And when you can pull it off, it's the stuff you're the proudest of because you see like, oh, it worked. That was great. That was like, it's like the little footprint or what it's like, and it's to me, I love that part of it. Like not at the time, but like afterwards, I think it's nice.
Those are the most satisfying moments in being an artist. And I think those moments are scary to maybe the line producer because they're worried about
I don't know what it is, but just book me a chimp.
who's
And
gonna cut this. But I think no, that I think those moments are you can't manufacture those. And so that's why each person's craft is so specific and special. It's specific and specialized to them. And then when you bring it to a bigger mission, that's when you get somebody can shine. It's really cool. Thank you so much for sharing, guys. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Charles and Dylan and Panu. And thank you for discussing with us today about your incredible work.